Russia is intensifying its campaign in Ukraine's eastern Donbas region, launching attacks on dozens of towns in Luhansk and Donetsk. The key industrial city of Severodonetsk is in growing danger of becoming completely surrounded. Having failed to capture the Ukrainian capital Kyiv and its second largest city, Kharkiv, Moscow is now focusing on smaller objectives. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy is demanding more heavy weaponry from the West, describing the situation in Donbas as extremely difficult.
Ukrainian forces are doing their best to push back Russian troops despite heavy shelling. In this village, now back in Ukrainian hands, residents tell of their fears as the Russians arrived. We tried to keep out of their way. Maybe we should go back to the basement, she says. As a team of Associated Press film, Russian artillery keep up the bombardment. Along the road, more evidence of the fighting. Russia's objective is to seize two Donbas provinces, Donetsk and Luhansk in the east. At least 12 people were killed by shelling as heavy fighting continues in and around Severodonetsk. The local governor says the Russians have taken 3 towns in the Donetsk region. Russian troops are gaining ground in the east. These are frontline positions, now abandoned by Ukraine. But further away from the fighting, in areas where the Ukrainians have regained control, residents are determined to start over.
People are returning home, even though it's safer to wait further away. People are coming back to their houses and starting to rebuild. They're helping our military.
As the battle for Donbas intensifies, many more lives will be lost.
Well, Ukrainian officials have talked about Russia pouring an insane number of fighters and equipment into Luhansk. I asked military analyst Frank Ledwich whether it was now inevitable that Russia would eventually take the eastern Donbas region.
Well, Phil, what we're going to see over the next 4 weeks, I don't think this is controversial or it's not brilliant military analysis or crystal ball gazing, is what will amount to a siege of that town, Severodonetsk, you mentioned earlier, which is quite big. It's actually a twin town, there's Lysychansk right next door to it. It's about 200, well, when they had people in them, they're about 200,000. So together about half the size of Mariupol. Ukraine has been preparing to defend those cities for about 7 years. Now as to an insane number of Russian forces coming in, what's happening is they're concentrating their attack now. I think there's about, within the area we were talking about before, where they were trying to get to take the highway, we're looking at about 20 battalions. But the Ukrainians can face those off. One thing that's not often mentioned, though, Phil, just to close on this question, if I might, are the huge Ukrainian losses. We very rarely hear anything about it. The Ukrainian government, as a matter of policy, and quite rightly doesn't comment on it. But from what I've heard, their casualties are really very severe. The thing is, they can replace those casualties, brutal though it sounds.
Right. And we have Western money, equipment and intelligence pouring into Ukraine at an unprecedented rate. So this is slowing down the bleeding, if I can put it that way. But is it likely to turn this around?
No, I don't think so. Not in the medium term, or certainly not in the short term. Many of those, some of that equipment and reinforcement is still stuck in the West. I don't know if it's getting down there. I'm hearing that there are issues with that, but these are short-term issues. In the medium term, yes, and then in the long term, Western support, Western intelligence help, and above all, Western logistics and equipment help will, I believe, who knows, turn that tide. But this is going to be a long war. Right. This is one battle in a long, long war, going probably into next year, unless there's a real surprise on one side or the other.
Because I've seen it written that given the poor performance of Russian forces, that perhaps Moscow would declare an end to this war if it captured Ukraine's eastern territories.
That's possible. Who knows what in Putin's head, and he runs the show. That, I think, the Ukrainians could present as some form of surrender, the way it would happen, or at least a concession. But the way that would happen is the Russians would simply stand on the defensive. Ukrainians would shape up to counterattack. And that's going to happen anyway. It doesn't really matter what's declared. It's what's going to happen on the ground. The Ukrainians aren't going to stop fighting because the Russians declare some sort of notional victory, which they haven't achieved. That would be a local success, which could and would, I think, in the longer term, be reversed.
Thank you for that. That's very clear. Frank Ledwich, military analyst.
Thanks very much, Phil.
I've also been speaking with our correspondent Rebecca Ritters, who's in Kyiv, and I asked her how people there are feeling about the war now that the fighting has moved away from the capital to the east.
Well, feelings really run the whole gamut here, Phil. You know, you've got obviously frustration and fatigue, but you also have that hopefulness and, you know, this is really a united city or a united western part of the country, if you will. People here really still believe that Ukraine can win this war. They say that the other option is just too horrible to think about. So people remaining hopeful. I mean, there is still some fear here. The sirens are still sounding, but there is a little bit of a sense of relief that now that the troops have left the surrounds of Kyiv. You know, I was here a couple of weeks ago. I've just returned to Kyiv, and it is a different feeling. It definitely feels like more of a normal city, if you will. You know, the sun is now shining, of course, that helps. But more restaurants and bars, not bars, but restaurants and cafes, that kind of thing are open. You see more people out in the streets. For all intents and purposes, you know, you could almost be forgiven for forgetting that the war is on it from time to time, except that people are still talking about it. It is really the main topic of conversation. People are still very worried, watching very carefully what is happening in the east. And yeah, of course, still really hopeful that they will end up being victorious.
I'm interested in what people are saying about the president, Vladimir Zelenskyy, because, of course, outside the country, he's become something of an icon of this struggle. How do Ukrainians feel about him and the way this war is going after 3 months?
Well, I certainly can't speak for every person in Ukraine, but I would say that if there was an election held today, President Zelenskyy would win in an absolute landslide. People that before the war perhaps didn't have that much faith in the president, that, you know, I spoke to one woman before, she said, well, actually, I thought it was a bit of a joke. You know, he was a comedian, he was an actor. I was very disappointed that he was elected. We all thought, how could a man like this be elected during wartime? She said, I now feel very embarrassed about holding that opinion because really he's proven himself to be such a wonderful leader. Nobody could unite the country in the way that he has done, and that is an opinion really held pretty much across the board, Phil. I mean, he's very, very popular here. People really think that he's been doing an absolutely wonderful job in trying to keep everyone together and lead this country and try and get support from the international community. So I would say his popularity has soared during this conflict. OK,
thank you for that. Rebecca Ritters in Kyiv. Now, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has said Russia's President Vladimir Putin cannot be allowed to win the war in Ukraine. In an address to the World Economic Forum, he repeated his country's support for Ukraine, but didn't address Kyiv's demands for more heavy weapons. Mr. Scholz said Russia's war is contributing to a global food crisis.
Discussion of the war in Ukraine and its effects dominated this year's World Economic Forum. Participants examined solutions for the leading global threats: food insecurity, energy, and the range of economic crises. These topics were also central to German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's keynote address, which wrapped up Thursday's event. The pandemic and Russia's war against Ukraine are threatening to roll back progress made over the last decades. Most dramatic, the fight against hunger and poverty. We are risking the world's biggest famine in decades if we don't respond decisively. During the G7 presidency, we launched Alliance for Global Food Security with the World Bank. Germany has set aside nearly €500 million. The global food crisis is a major risk for poorer countries in Asia and Africa.
It's a very, very difficult time for African countries because it's like it's gotten them offside. Countries are in more debt because of COVID. Countries are struggling with climate change. And 125 million people got hungry because of COVID globally. A lot of those, 30% of those are in Africa. Another additional 100 million people is expected to go hungry. So this could be really serious.
And now, as the world's most powerful players leave Davos, the focus will turn to putting the plans and promises they've discussed into motion.
Well, this year's did seem like a fundamentally different event, so did it bring fundamentally different insights? I asked DW correspondent Christy Pladsen, who was there.
I mean, I think the real question is what really was possible with Davos this year. We had German Chancellor Olaf Scholz here this morning, but he was the only G7 leader to show this year. And if we take a step back, it maybe makes sense why. Davos is associated with the rich and powerful, with luxury up here in the mountains. And global leaders have a huge laundry list of issues to deal with right now. Everything from obviously the war in Ukraine, but also the ongoing pandemic, a looming food crisis, rising food prices, and a continued threat to the global economic recovery. So many of them are off dealing with those issues. Meanwhile, the people who are here this year, the delegations and the politicians and the business leaders, they're also concerned with these very same issues. What we did see emerging out of this week was unity around these issues, a big sense of urgency in solving them. But business leaders seem to be feeling like they're stuck a bit, that politicians need to act and that the war in Ukraine needs to end before they can move on to address these things.
OK, so no world political leaders there, it's all business leaders. But President Zelenskyy did make an appearance demanding more military hardware from world leaders. What sort of response did he get?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the West has been providing military support to Ukraine since the war began, but so far that's been largely Soviet-era weaponry. And yes, Zelenskyy was asking now for more modern warfare, particularly, for example, long-range weaponry that could sink ships, because Russia's Navy is currently blocking huge shipments of grain from leaving the country. Now, it does seem to be a growing openness to considering providing the country with modern warfare, because there are many markets around the globe that desperately need these grains, again, because there's a shortage of food around the globe. Earlier this week, we saw Denmark saying it would provide weapons to Ukraine. The U.S. has already agreed to provide modern weaponry, but other countries are being very cautious. Russia has said that the West is already in a proxy war with Russia, so to speak, by helping Ukraine militarily. So they are proceeding with caution still at this point.
Of course, other big issues besides the war, climate change notable amongst them. Did that get pushed to one side?
Right. Well, we heard a little bit about some protests nearby, but up here it can feel like a bit of a Davos bubble with the forests and the mountains that you see behind me. So participants didn't seem to feel particularly affected by these protests, for example. But that being said, global warming was the topic of around a third of the panels that we saw this week. So it's definitely an important agenda point for the forum this year. But we also had billionaire George Soros saying at a meeting earlier this week that he thinks the war in Ukraine is overshadowing the climate change crisis and that this could be fatal for humanity.
OK, thank you for that, Christy. Christy Pladsen at the World Economic Forum.